Welcome to the Elden Conspiracy. You probably know the drill at this point. Today we will be going over a theory for which there is very little direct evidence, but my hunch is very strong, so let's get to it. Back in the before time, that is, 2022, I used to post my theories to Reddit. One of my first posts was about how Horolu came from Farum Azula. My evidence for this was the Farum Azulan architecture around Upper Lanedell, and the designs under his statue at Stormvale, as well as the designs of his boss room. However, I later changed my mind. I made a post a few months later about how Horolu actually came from the Badlands. I've now come to a third conclusion, that these two origins of Horolu and the rest of the Badlands warriors might not be as different as I initially thought. In this video we will be investigating the origins of the warriors of the Badlands by looking at their equipment and establishing connections to other ancient cultures. First, let's talk about what we know about the Badlands. We know it lies outside the lands between. This is heavily implied from Nefeli's dialogue when she takes the throne of Stormvale.
I remembered the vow I took when I first became a warrior, so many moons ago. This land is much like the one from which I hail.
Also, from the circumstances of Horalou's death from the intro movie. While it is not explicitly stated, it is reasonable to think Horolu died in the Badlands. In the culture of the Badlands, one becomes a warrior as a rite of passage, from slaying countless foes. They shun excess adornment and value physical prowess above all. Their culture has a strange relationship to beasts, as we will detail later, and most likely lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle in their homeland. They are the quintessential barbarians of Elden Ring's world. The only two characters we know of who for sure came from the Badlands are Nefeli and Hoarah Loux. However, there is one other character who may fit the bill. Bernals, the Tarnished you meet in Storm Hill and later in Volcano Manor, I believe is also a warrior of the Badlands, or at least of a peripheral culture. The first piece of evidence is how strongly he resembles the default warrior preset. It's almost uncanny. As I detailed from a previous video, the warrior preset represents the population of the Badlands, where Horolu is also from. Bernals acts very proud to be a Tarnished, and you can tell from his dialogue that he considers the Tarnished to be a kind of warrior class.
Are you here in the lands between to take up the fight? Does your faith in the guidance of grace hold firm, despite the collapse of the Golden Order? Yes, you're a Tarnished through and through.
Bernals seems to have a connection to Farum Azula. Not only does he invade you in Farum Azula, but his armor has some interesting facts. The Beast Champion's armor describes how beasts are drawn to champions. This is a relationship we can see with Hoarah Loux. Once he becomes Godfrey, he takes the Beast Chancellor Siraj on his back. We can say that Siraj was drawn to him for being a champion. Farum Azula itself is populated mostly by beasts, and the Beast Champion's armor seems inextricably linked to this location. The statue in Malekith's boss room, which depicts a young girl being tended to by wolves, I think is symbolic of a hierarchical relationship between humans and beasts in the culture of Farum Azula. That the beasts once served humans, this is in keeping with the relationship expressed in the Beast Champion's armor. The armor has unique stylistic features that are not repeated in any other armor type. It doesn't have the medieval knight's armor look, but rather something a bit more Bronze Age. The helm has an even more interesting description. It shows three creatures, leonine and bearing wings, very similar to the leonine misbegotten we encounter in the lands between. Yet this description calls them beasts. All three are holding what appears to be a cinquedea, an item we know is very important to the culture of the beastmen. The beasts represent an oath. See nothing, hear nothing, doubt nothing, and carry on, along the path set in stone. This in many ways reminds me of what the Tarnished are often told, yet there is no mention of the guidance of grace. Instead we hear of a path set in stone. Interpreting this item alone can take up a whole episode. Suffice to say, the oath of the Beast Champion helm is especially ironic coming from Bernals, considering he only puts it on once he joins the recusants of the Volcano Manor, a group of wayward Tarnished who openly reject their obligations to the Erdtree and the Golden Order. We also can't ignore the evidence our other warriors of the Badlands have which link them to Farum Azula. As I've mentioned in previous videos, Godfrey is always accompanied by Farum Azula designs. His own axe has very similar markings to the weapons of the Beastmen. It's also curious that, when Horolu takes on the name Godfrey and becomes Elden Lord, he builds several battle arenas in an architectural style which most resembles Farum Azula, although with some notable differences. Even Hoarah Loux, though I do not believe she ever set foot in Farum Azula, has a weapon which also bears resemblance to those of the Beastmen. Why do the two warriors of the Badlands have weapons which seem to have originated in the floating city? So I think it is vital now to talk about Farum Azula itself, and what we can say about its ancient population from the evidence of its environment. When we arrive in Farum Azula, we find that the place is populated mostly by beastmen. We also find embedded in the walls countless bestial skeletons and trinkets which appear to have originated in the beastmen's culture. We see lots of evidence that the beastmen have been here for a very long time. We also find carved into the walls statues of human beings. Many places in Farum Azula appear to have once been parks or promenades where people walked. The centerpiece of Malekith's boss room is a statue of a human girl. We can group these statues and carvings of the city into two time strata. First, there are the carvings on the walls, which are human and twin bird related. Then there are the beast and dragon statues, which are not part of the original construction and were most likely built afterward. There are some lore hunters who propose that the beastmen built the city, citing their intelligence alluded to in various item descriptions. If we examine the behavior of the beastmen and the appearance of their items, it gives more context to this narrative. Their shield is formed from a clay pot. Clay is a terrible material from which to make a shield. As one would think, the shield has horrible stats. Furthermore, we can look at the beastman's cleaver. The item description describes it as forged, yet it clearly looks like a repurposed piece of debris, something that was not originally a weapon. Based on these two items, I think we can doubt the intelligence of the beasts, at least when it comes to building the city itself. The descriptions of their items, their intelligence, and their odd ways is meant to be ironic. This evidence that the beast clergyman statues are not part of the original construction, and the dubious craftsmanship of their gear, I believe shows that it was the human population who built Farum Azula to begin with. This somewhat sizable human population lived alongside the beasts and treated them like second-class citizens. I believe the Malekith boss room statue and the beast champion's armor are both emblematic of this relationship, that the beasts were servants of the humans. Although I do not think that the beastmen built the city of Farum Azula, I don't doubt that the city in its heyday was an oppressive hierarchical system, with the beasts afforded few rights, and perhaps treated as nothing more than sacrifices. The skeletons in the walls and columns strongly resemble the practices of certain real-world ancient cultures, which we now call foundation sacrifice. People used to be sacrificed in the foundations of buildings in order to ward away bad weather and natural disasters. When we consider the very center of the city as a gigantic natural disaster, the piles of corpses become more ominous. To explain the incredibly morbid method of construction, I speculate that the beastmen were sacrificed by the human population in an attempt to avert the storm that would eventually destroy it. But this brings up a conundrum. If Farum Azula was once populated by humans, why are there so few human corpses? This is the question that has been bugging me for months. We do see a few human corpses, resembling the long-necked commoners from the lands between. But all the remains we see of the once living are nearly always beastmen. If there were human Farum Azulans, surely there would be graves and such dedicated to them, right? Looking at the descriptions of two items, I think we may be able to piece together a narrative which explains the large amount of beast remains. The Beastman Ashes describes Farum Azula as a mausoleum. What this tells me is that, to the beastmen themselves, Farum Azula is a place where the worthy dead are laid to rest, which they feel sworn to protect. The Old Lord's Talisman tells a somewhat different story. It describes Farum Azula as an ancient city, somewhat different from the idea of a mausoleum. What we can tell is that Farum Azula was once a city, then became a mausoleum. We can assume that the ancient city was the time period when the human population flourished. There's only one event we can really point to as the cause of this shift, that is, the shattering of Farum Azula itself. The reason we see so few human corpses is because they all decided to leave shortly before the city was shattered. Most of the remains of the dead we see in Farum Azula came as a consequence of its destruction, or afterward. The next question we may ask is, why didn't any of the beastmen leave? Well, many of them certainly did. Grail's dragon burrow was evidently settled by beastmen who fled Farum Azula. We also see beastmen of Farum Azula as bosses in several places. But where did the humans go? Many of you have probably seen where I'm going with this. They went to the Badlands. I believe the warriors of the Badlands are the descendants of human refugees who fled Farum Azula when the city was shattered. When their home was destroyed, they were forced to survive in the harsh environment of the Badlands. They were able to keep some form of Farum Azulan culture alive, since we can see Hoarah Loux taking various Farum Azulan traditions and styles with him when he comes to the Lands Between to become Elden Lord. I believe the Beast Champion armor worn by Bernals was made by the warriors of Farum Azula when the city was at the height of its power. The warriors would go on to shun excess adornment to adapt to their new environment. This would make Bernals, or at least the city itself, extremely old. While inexplicable, this is not unheard of in Souls games. The characters Alfred from Bloodborne, Dusk, and Marvelous Chester from Dark Souls are also the sort of character who seem lost in time and shouldn't exist. It is a pattern of Miyazaki-designed games for there to be characters whose mere existence defies the traditional perception of time, when you think about it hard enough. We know many of the Tarnished, before being born in the Lands Between, died in very disparate time periods relative to each other, but all of them were somehow summoned to the Lands Between at around the same time. When taking this into account, it is possible that Bernals died a long time ago, and was just reborn recently. Or maybe he just inherited the armor from a relative, or stole it, which are also viable explanations. Since the Tarnished are descendants of Hoarah Loux's kin, this would make Farum Azula the ancestral home of the Tarnished by extension. This could be the reason why, near the end of our journey, we find ourselves transported to Farum Azula. Perhaps the Tarnished are fated to return to the floating city, in a way not dissimilar to Grace. The role the Tarnished play in the story of Elden Ring, the designs of Queen Marika, and the machinations of the Fingers has been for the most part unexplored territory. Hopefully, this is the start of a greater theory about the Tarnished and their ancient assignment, to sort out the many contradictions at the heart of our quest. This has been the Elden Conspiracy, signing out.